Welcome back to the final session in the Electric Guitar and American Culture Conference for the Saturday afternoon. If you're just joining us, my name's Chris Smith. I'm professor and chair of musicology at Texas Tech and also director of the Vernacular Music Center. I also want to be sure to acknowledge my associate director, Roger Landis, whose vision is really the core and the engine for behind the conference and the shows that we've had last night and tonight. I'm really delighted to welcome our next guest for this keynote lecture for the EGAC conference. Deke Dickerson is one of the great roots musicians, and I would argue roots music scholars of our era. He's a Missouri boy, like Roger Landis himself, moved to LA at the age of 22, and has played a huge variety of American roots musics. There's one quote in his bio, which I'm going to read aloud because I really think it's wonderful. He says, rock and roll, rockabilly, western swing, rhythm and blues, surf music, garage punk, these are every bit as vital and important as jazz or classical music. And I would absolutely agree with that. It's one of our core beliefs here at the Vernacular Music Center. Deke's also an author of magazine and journal articles, has written lots of recording liner notes. He's also written two-volume book on guitar collecting with the wonderful title, The Strat in the Attic and The Strat in the Attic 2. He's also just published, as you can see on your screen here, an authorized biography of Merle Travis, which is really pretty wonderful. And he's here today to talk about some other parts of his research into the history of the electric guitar. I'm going to share my screen and his slideshow right now for a talk entitled Bigsby and Fender, How the Solid Body Electric Guitar Went from a Tiny California Garage Workshop to Conquering Texas and the World. Would you on the Zoom and you in the room please join me in welcoming the great Deke Dickerson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. I'm happy to be here today and proud to be part of this whole symposium conference. The things that I'm going to talk about today have probably been touched on by some of the other presenters here today, but I'll go into them in my own special way with my own little special slant. And I discussed this idea with Roger. He seemed to think that this would be, why not? Let's do this here. Just to get started, I'm always been fascinated with how technology influences societies and how technology influences cultures and things like that. From the invention of the wheel to the cotton gin to the automobile to the cell phone and the computer and all these different things. And I think that the case could be made, arguably, that the electric guitar was in the top 10 most significant inventions of the 20th century, just in terms of things that really changed the culture, especially here in America. I'm not talking about the world, but definitely here in America. And the history of the electric guitar is a fascinating one to me. Just to get right back to the very beginning of the electric guitar, it's a bit like the invention of the automobile or the invention of the airplane. There were several people that were working on ideas before the first really viable one came about. And so in the 1920s, you had guys, should I look more this way? Off mic slightly. Yeah, see, I'm a musician. I'm used to just putting it right up there on my lips. In the 1920s, people started inventing prototypes for electric guitars. This was a result of the vacuum tube. Basically, if you're not familiar with the vacuum tube, this was the way that they first amplified electronic signals. And in the early 1900s, people were experimenting with vacuum tubes. They first started selling and marketing vacuum tubes in 1915, and everything really took off very quickly after that. You had radios, it really took off, especially in terms of sound amplification. Well, once you have sound amplification, all these different guys were trying to find ways to amplify the electric guitar. Strangely enough, and even though I live in Los Angeles, I still find this strange that, you have this history of musical equipment manufacturers on the East Coast and Chicago, Martin Guitars in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, Gibson in Kalamazoo, Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. But the electric guitar, as we know it, was actually invented in Los Angeles. and we're celebrating the 90th anniversary of that happening. Like I said, even though there were people that were experimenting with it in the 1920s, some of them with ideas as primitive as just taking a needle from a record player and sticking it into the top of an acoustic guitar to just slightly amplify it a little bit. So there were different ways that people were trying to achieve this. But the company that would eventually become Rickenbacker in Los Angeles, they were called Ropatin in the early 1930s. They invented the electric guitar with the magnetic string pickup, the same one that we all use today, in 1931, 1932. And if we have the first slide ready to go, this fellow here that is holding this is Gage Brewer, who was a Wichita, Kansas band leader. And I guess he was doing pretty well. He ran a ballroom in Wichita, and he always bought the very best equipment he possibly could. He had some highly ornate national guitars. He sort of had a Hawaiian orchestra, which was popular at the time. And he went out to Los Angeles and he bought 2 instruments from the very first batch of electric guitars that Ropatin, later Rickenbacker, would make. And he's pictured here with these. And you can see the date on this this newspaper article from Wichita when he brought these guitars back there was October of 1932. So that's really the dawn of electric guitar was 1932. One of the things I'm going to talk about during this presentation is just when certain things are ingrained, and I know that musicians are often slow to, we can think about recognizing turntablists as musicians as a good example. We're often slow to recognize new things and new technologies. So the electric guitar got off to a really, really slow start. Even though it was invented in 1932, it wasn't until 1936 that any other electric guitar manufacturers really started making them, Gibson and people like that. And at that time, you can see from this photo, the very top thing that Gage is holding is a lap steel. Lap steel was the predominant electric instrument. And it was made out of solid wood, or in this case, solid aluminum, and it had an electrical pickup on it, and guys played it in their lap. That's not my battery going dead or anything. Okay. Okay. And any electric Spanish guitars, which were ones that were held in the regular fashion, they were acoustic guitars with a pickup stuck on them. That was just how they were. And so it went for quite a while. And the lap steel had this reputation as a singing instrument. Guys could get sustain out of it and these sort of singing phrases, and it was something that they couldn't achieve on acoustic instruments. And so gradually the electric amplification of musical instruments became accepted mostly through Hawaiian and country music with the invention of this electric lap steel. The electric Spanish guitar was much more slowly adapted into other types of music, but I'm going to get into that just a little bit. I should mention that there were a few odd prototypes that were made during the 1930s that were solid body guitars, played in the Spanish style with a round neck. In 1936, Rickenbacker made a Bakelite Spanish solid body guitar, but it was a tiny, tiny little thing. I believe the next photo is a photo of that. Yeah, this is from the 1936 Rickenbacker catalog, and you can see they were coming out with these electrified instruments made out of Bakelite, which was sort of a hardened, molded plastic. And there's an electric ukulele, an electric lap steel guitar, and that's Beryl Harrell on the lap steel guitar. I did a story about her, a really fascinating story. And the woman on the right there is playing one of their very first electric Spanish solid body instruments. But as you can see, it had a tiny body. It had the same size body as a lap steel. It wasn't really a practical instrument. It was sort of a novelty. And that's the way it went with electrified solid body Spanish guitars for over 10 years, almost 15 years. There was a wood-bodied attempt made by the Slingerland company, the same company that makes drums. They made a lap steel out of wood called the Slingerland Songster, and then they also made a Spanish version that they must have sold about 10 of because they're incredibly rare today. And that was it. People really thought of the electrified Spanish guitar as a hollow instrument with a pickup on it. So let's see the next slide, because I'm forgetting which the next one was. So in the early 1940s, Les Paul, who was a popular sort of pop jazz guitar player, he did a bunch of wacky inventions. And I was actually talking with my friend Jay Frank about this instrument right here earlier today. This is commonly known as Les Paul's log. And Les Paul sliced up an Epiphone archtop, a hollow body guitar, and he put a 4x4 in the middle of solid wood and attached pickups to it. And of course, Les claimed that he invented the electric solid body guitar. Like a lot of Les's claims, there's truth to it, but we can't really establish when the log was made. One thing that I have found in studying the log is that I don't think he ever used it on anything, which is kind of fascinating considering that he went to all that trouble to make a solid body guitar with a 4x4 in the middle of it, and then he never used it. He just started bringing it out again when Les Paul got rediscovered in the 1970s and 1980s, taking a lot of photos with it. You know, it's in the Country Music Hall of Fame. So it is a significant instrument, but it was never marketed, and I don't even think Les Paul ever used it. Let's see what the next slide is. Okay, so when we get back to the electric guitar being invented in Los Angeles, there's guitar manufacturers. There's just a lot of manufacturing that is going on in Los Angeles in the 1930s. And then once World War II hits, Los Angeles becomes a very important hub for the defense industry. And this results in two things. Number one, it results in a lot of stuff being made in Los Angeles. It also results in a lot of Okies and Arkies and Texas people and Missouri people and just people evading the Dust Bowl and bad times and moving out to Los Angeles where there were all these jobs. So as a direct result of all these manufacturing jobs, these people wanted to hear country music. Those were two things that were happening in Los Angeles in the early 1940s. And during World War II, country music became a huge boom industry. And I want to talk about that a little bit and talk about this guy right here. This guy here on the motorcycle is Paul Bigsby. Paul Bigsby was a guy that was born in the late 1800s. He was a machinist. He was one of the very earliest motorcycle racers. You know, when they first invented the sport, he was one of the guys that was out there racing on those crazy banked wooden tracks. When he got a little bit too old to race motorcycles anymore, he started working for the Crocker Company, and he's seen here on a very rare Crocker motorcycle. Crocker motorcycles were basically built one at a time by hand, and Paul Bigsby would pour the aluminum castings and make all these aluminum parts by hand for these motorcycles. This comes into play very shortly, you'll hear. Paul Bigsby was also a huge country music fan, and he really wanted to learn how to play lap steel guitar. Well, during World War II, a lot of metals were rationed. You couldn't find certain things. You had to go raid the junkyards to find magnets out of automobile magnetos to make pickups out of. So during World War II, Paul Bigsby made his own lap steel, and it was basically a copy of a Rickenbacker frying pan, which is the one that we saw in the very first slide. He started taking this around to some of the country music shows in Los Angeles, and pretty soon, the #1 hotshot steel guitar player in Los Angeles at the time, a guy named Joaquin Murphy, started playing his Bigsby lap steel guitar. And everybody remarked at what an amazing sounding instrument it was. This was, at a time, the early 1940s, mid-1940s, you could easily find Gibson lap steel guitars, Rickenbacker lap steel guitars. They were being made in large quantities then. But Bigsby's handmade instruments were really well crafted and sounded really good. And Joaquin Murphy was sort of the Eddie Van Halen of the lap steel guitar. He was so good that people just thought, oh, it must be the guitar, right? No, it was really in his hands. He probably could have played a log with barbed wire on it and it would have sounded about the same. But Merle Travis was a guy who moved to Los Angeles in 1944. He was from Kentucky. He played a interesting rural style of guitar that would eventually be known as Travis picking. It was kind of a thumb picking, finger picking style with its roots kind of based in blues, but it was a mixture of blues and hillbilly and pop and Dixieland and jazz and all kinds of stuff. A lot of very interesting chords. He was sort of the master of this style, and he became famous on the radio in the 1930s in Cincinnati, and then when his marriage crashed and he tried enlisting in the Marines during World War II, and they threw him out after 6 weeks, told him he was unsuitable to be in the armed forces. He just decided, screw it, I'm moving to Los Angeles. So he borrowed money from all the people on his WLW radio show, took a train out to Los Angeles, and began playing in the country music scene out there. Merle Travis began playing with Joaquin Murphy, the steel guitar player. Let's see what the next slide is. Okay, this is a picture of Merle Travis and Paul Bigsby together. So Merle Travis at the time was playing a Gibson L10 with a pickup on it and creating quite a storm. He was on the radio in Los Angeles 4 or 5 times a day. He got signed to Capitol Records, which was a brand new company there in Los Angeles. He began to have hit records on Capitol Records starting in 1946 and 1947. He decided, after watching Joaquin Murphy play the steel guitar, that he wanted that sound, but out of an electric Spanish guitar. And so one day, he was hanging out with his country music friend, Paul Bigsby, and he drew some cartoons on a piece of mimeographed paper from this radio show that he was on in Pasadena. And these cartoons, we discovered them when I was writing the book about Merle Travis. They kind of look like Salvador Dali concept drawings of what an electric solid body might look like. It was definitely an abstract idea that Merle had. Well, I want a regular guitar that sustains and sounds like a lap steel. So Paul Bigsby took that back to his garage in Downey, California, just a tiny one-car garage, and over the period of a few months, made this guitar that you see in this photo right here. This guitar was finished in May of 1948, and despite the things that I've mentioned earlier, the little small-bodied Rickenbacker Bakelite guitar and the Slingerland Songster that they only made 10 of, this guitar right here was really the first modern electric solid body guitar. And, you know, if Merle had been in Kentucky and built this guitar, it probably would not have made much of a splash. But it just so happened that Los Angeles at that time, at a particular time in history, it was sort of the center of the universe for a lot of this stuff. Not only was there a huge country music scene there, Les Paul was living in Los Angeles at that exact time. Leo Fender had just started a company in Fullerton, California called Fender Guitars, and he started making lap steels and amplifiers. And so all these people were sort of bubbling around Los Angeles in the late 1940s. Well, as soon as people started seeing Merle Travis going around playing this crazy looking guitar, people took notice. Let's see what the next slide is. I think it's another one of Merle. So this is an article that was published in a country music fan newspaper magazine, and his dream came true. And he's talking about how Merle Travis designed this guitar and he had this idea for it. But my favorite part of this article, I'm sure you can't read the small print, is that the guy writing the article, he can't grasp the importance of the fact that Merle Travis has basically invented the solid body electric guitar. Basically, the only thing he can really come up with at the end of the article is he says, other people want one of these guitars and are willing to pay up to $600 for one. That was what he thought was really important was, oh my God, these crazy people are going to pay $600 for one of these. But it really was sort of a monumental thing, this idea that Merle Travis had that was put into reality by Paul Bigsby. And let's see what the next photograph is. Okay, so this is a famous story, and it really holds so much importance to the musical instrument world. Leo Fender had a very small company. He made lap steels and amplifiers by the dozens. He was not making a huge amount of musical instruments at this time. And he also ran a side business of renting a PA system out to local shows. And he would rent his PA system out at a local country music dance in an Orange County suburb called Placentia, California. Well, one weekend, Merle Travis came in with his solid body Bigsby electric guitar. Now, Leo Fender had been working on instruments for Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys at this point. I was just talking about that with Jay Frank earlier today. But something about Travis's guitar really inspired him, and he asked if he could borrow this guitar from Merle Travis for a week. So Leo borrowed Merle's guitar, and a very short time later, he made 2 prototypes. As you can see this guitar right here. This is the second one. Made 2 prototypes of what would eventually become, when it was first released, the Fender 2 Pickup Esquire, then the Fender Broadcaster, then a year after that, it became the Fender Telecaster, which is one of the most well-known designs of all time. And really what you can see Leo did is Leo took the Bigsby idea of a solid electric guitar, very much based on a lap steel, and he just made it more of a working man's guitar. Merle Travis's guitar was a very fancy guitar built for a star, lots of little ornamentation and gingerbread, as they would call it. This is a extremely basic guitar. It's got 1 pickup. It's just a bare bones guitar, volume and tone, and that is what was going to sell. The reason why Paul Bigsby's guitars are not as well known as Leo Fender's guitars is because Paul Bigsby really had no designs on making guitars other than he really liked making 1 instrument a month in his garage in Downey, California, and going to a lot of country music shows and hanging out with country music stars. That was really about as far as he went. Now, a few years later, a lot of you know the Bigsby name because he invented the Bigsby tailpiece on a suggestion from Merle Travis. And he eventually had to wind up mass producing those Bigsby tailpieces. This was something he hated because he actually had to hire a couple of employees and he had to, pay taxes and keep records and all that kind of stuff. Bigsby wanted no part of any of that kind of stuff. Leo Fender, on the other hand, had a very sharp business mind. And he said, if we take the fancy stuff off of this guitar, we make it really bare bones, and we make it so that the average player can afford it, they'll buy these things. Now, it was still a tough push. When the guitar was first introduced in 1950, people looked at it as, what is this? It's like a plank with strings on it. Leo was also a very big country music fan, just like Paul Bigsby. In fact, one of my absolute favorite Leo Fender quotes of all time is when the guitar player editor Tom Wheeler asked Leo Fender, "Did you ever get to meet Jimi Hendrix?" Leo immediately said, "No, but I met Bob Wills." He was super excited about that. Not so much about Hendrix. But Leo knew that if he could get some of the country music stars playing Fender guitars, that other people would buy them and play them. So Leo got a guy named Jimmy Bryant, who interestingly enough had ordered a custom Bigsby guitar, but then changed his mind and never got it. He got Jimmy Bryant to play this prototype Broadcaster Telecaster guitar. And Jimmy Bryant was another one of these guys like Joaquin Murphy that literally you could hand him a log with a barbed wire on it and he would make it sound incredible. But when he started playing this guitar, all of a sudden people wanted to buy it. Let's see what the next slide is, because I think so here's the very first advertising that they did for the Fender Broadcaster model in 1950. If you know anything about the history of this guitar, it originally came out as the Fender 2 pickup Esquire. They maybe made 20 or 25 of those. Then they came out with the Broadcaster. Gretsch sent them a cease and desist letter and said, you can't call it the Broadcaster because we have some drums that are called Broadcaster drums. So about a year after this, they changed the name to the Telecaster. And these sold like hotcakes. Let's see the next slide. So I just wanted to bring in another photo of Les Paul here. This is Les. I believe this photo was taken at his Los Angeles home sometime in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And I talk about this in my book a little bit. Les Paul knew Merle Travis, but he didn't like Merle Travis that much because Merle Travis had dated Mary Ford, his wife, before they ever got together, when she was known by her original name, Colleen Summers. And Merle was a bit of a ladies' man. He got in a lot of trouble that way. But the one thing that is interesting, if you look at this picture, and this is the guitar known as the Clunker. It's not the Log. It's a hollow Epiphone guitar that he called the Clunker. And if you see the bridge pickup, that is a Bigsby electric guitar pickup. So when you realize just how influential Bigsby was on not only Fender, but also Gibson and what would eventually become the Les Paul, this whole tiny sprout starts to bloom and it becomes a giant tree, and you realize, oh, Paul Bigsby and that Merle Travis guitar are sort of like the roots of this whole thing. Let's see what the next photo is. So here's a picture of the very first Gibson Les Paul, the gold top, and you can see that, you know, Les just couldn't help himself. He had to just modify the heck out of every guitar that he owned. I mean, I think this picture was probably taken in 1954. The guitar was only a year or two old, and he's already got a DeArmond pickups in it because he didn't like the Gibson P90 pickups. He's got a Vibrola vibrato stuck on it. So, you know, there's a whole, you could have an entire weekend symposium about Les Paul's actual relationship to the Les Paul guitar, because he really didn't play it very much on his hit records. You know, by the time that the Les Paul came out in 1952, Les's hit records were basically done. And then all throughout the years, he played versions of guitars like this that started out as Gibson Les Pauls and then got highly customized to other instruments. Let's see what the next slide is. So in 1954, after selling a whole bunch of Telecaster guitars and Broadcasters before that, Leo Fender came out with his next sort of iconic design. It was called the Stratocaster. And the Stratocaster, really from a design standpoint, was a pretty primitive guitar when it first came out. It had 3 pickups, but you could only select 1 pickup at a time. You could not select 2 pickups or 3 pickups being on. And the main reason that he wanted to make the Stratocaster was because Bigsby had this vibrato, and they were starting to put Bigsby vibratos on Gibson guitars. Leo realized that he needed to make a guitar with a vibrato on it. So the Stratocaster came out with his tremolo action. You can see right up there at the top. And what's really interesting about the Stratocaster is it's probably the most popular guitar in the entire world. It's the most played, recorded, sold instrument of all time. But Leo really invented this guitar in 1954 to be used by country musicians like Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. He really had no idea that these rock and rollers were right around the corner, that were going to start playing loud stuff on his guitars, or guys like, you know, blues guitar players, and eventually guys like Jimi Hendrix would be coaxing these incredible sounds out of the guitar. So really the design of the Stratocaster was sort of a happy accident. It was a hillbilly guitar when it first came out, but then became something much different. And man, they're still selling like 1 million of them a year. It's crazy. Let's see what the next slide is. So I want to just sort of shift this whole thing. I spoke a little bit about how Paul Bigsby was really content just to build one guitar at a time in his little garage workshop. That was all he ever really wanted out of life. And Leo Fender had this design on really selling a lot of guitars. But he kind of had a hard job in front of him, which was convincing guitarists who had been using these hollow body electric guitars to switch to these Fender solid body guitars. And Leo did have a business mind. He very much had a business mind. If you're aware of the fact that his first venture was called K&F, he started with Doc Kaufman, who was the K in K&F. That was going to be the brand name. But then Leo said, look, we have to mortgage our homes in order to get enough money to buy the tooling and everything else that we're going to need to mass produce these guitars. And Doc Kaufman said, I'm out. And so that's why it became the Fender manufacturing company. So Leo did have a business mind, but then the smartest thing that he did was he hired these really, really savvy advertising people and sales people and distribution people. And that's how Texas comes into this conversation, because he hired a guy named Don Randall, who eventually made Randall amplifiers, if you've ever seen those. Don Randall was a hustler. He was a guy that just went out and sold these guitars, went around, and he knew that the initial audience for these guitars were not going to be high-class jazz musicians, pop musicians. He was going straight for country musicians, blues musicians, people that were playing in dive bars and gut bucket type places. He knew that's where they had to sell these guitars. So Don Randall exclusively at first went around to all these places in the Southwest, not just California, but also Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. And eventually they set up some pretty big distribution points in Tulsa and Dallas, and I want to say Phoenix. Don't quote me on that if anybody's watching this. But this was one of the smartest things that he ever did, because Bigsby Guitars, he wound up making 23 guitars total. That's how many Bigsby ever made. Leo knew that if they had these salesmen and the distributors in place and these stores were carrying them, and then they had these great advertisements in the magazines and everything, that people would start playing them. And so by the mid-1950s, when rock and roll came in, Fender was perfectly poised to take advantage of this, because rock and rollers, they wanted something new. They wanted something radical, something that was not from the 1930s or the 1940s. They wanted something that was kind of crazy. And so that's why guys like Lubbock's own Buddy Holly bought himself a brand new Fender Stratocaster, because he thought, this is new, this is modern, this is cool. And one of the things that I've always really enjoyed about Buddy Holly's music, and this guy Sonny Curtis, who played with him early on, is you can hear these guys were clearly trying to play like Merle Travis or Chet Atkins or Scotty Moore on Elvis's records, but they had Stratocasters. So all of a sudden, it just sounded completely different. See what we have next, because I can't remember. So here is a photo of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys circa the mid-1950s, and you can see there's Lou Walker over there on the right-hand side playing a brand new Fender Stratocaster guitar. And this photo right here is really, this is Leo Fender's dream. He wanted to see Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys with a Fender guitar, a Fender steel guitar, and all Fender amplifiers behind them. That was really, in his mind, that was as high up the food chain as you could get. But I stuck this picture in here just because this is in the era where Bob was back here in Texas, and I know for a fact that, especially through Leon McAuliffe and the Tulsa distributors, that man, they always just got these brand new Fender instruments, brand new Fender amplifiers every time they came out. And part of this is leading into the next thing I'm going to talk about in Texas music, which is that this highly effective distribution, advertising, salesman strategy that they had wound up influencing a lot of Texas music over the last 50, 60 years. Let's see what the next slide is. So this is Sid King and the Five Strings, who were a rockabilly band from Denton, Texas. And as you can see, they also played the Strat and the Fender steel guitar. And as far as, Texas rockabilly and rock and roll acts are concerned, I think that Buddy Holly and Sid King and the Five Strings were the two first really to start playing Fender instruments here in this state. And another side effect that I don't think Leo really planned on was that blues players discovered Fender solid body instruments and not only liked the tones that they produced, but also liked the durability and invincibility of his instruments. And was it you I was talking about, Jay Frank, about how people loved Fender instruments because they could drop them out of trucks and they'd still work? I mean, I've dropped my Stratocaster and it's still in tune. Like, how is that possible? So this guy right here, Long John Hunter, he was a blues guitar player that played in Juarez, Mexico, back in the 1950s and early 1960s. And this is one of my favorite guitar stories, actually. This guitar that you see him playing in this picture was a Fender Telecaster that belonged to the club, because Juarez, Mexico was so dangerous that you couldn't actually walk down the street with a guitar. You couldn't keep a guitar in your apartment without it getting stolen. So they had one guitar that was owned by the club, and whoever came in there to play played this house guitar. And that's, there he is right there. And there's Mr. Albert Collins from Houston, Texas, who also perfected a ice pick blues tone with his Fender Telecaster. And, I have this theory. I sort of already mentioned the invincibility of these things, but I have talked to a lot of guys that said, man, back in those days, your guitar also had to double as a weapon. I mean, if there was a bad fight that started happening, like, you could actually use your guitar to knock some guy out. So maybe that's another reason why Fender guitars took off with the blues players, besides the tone. And then this is a picture of Billy Gibbons there, that clean-shaven man there on the right, wearing the white turtleneck, playing a Fender Stratocaster with his early psychedelic band, the Moving Sidewalks. And Billy's been very associated with the Gibson Les Paul, but especially in the early days of not only the Moving Sidewalks, but the early days of ZZ Top, he played a Fender Stratocaster as well, for a lot of the same reasons that these other guys did. Yeah, let's see what's next. I'm just looking at my notes here, and I should also mention that we talk about the Telecaster, and we talk about the Stratocaster, and we talk about these Fender amplifiers and all these other things that Leo Fender did over the years. But I really think that Leo Fender's biggest contribution to music and music culture was the invention of the electric bass in 1951. Now, there had been electric basses before that, kind of like when we were talking about the earliest electric guitars. There were other people doing it. But he was the guy that said, no, we got to make it real straight ahead and simple, 34-inch scale length to get the full intonation. He had it all worked out by 1951, but people were really slow to adapt to it. But eventually, the electric bass, so many people just called it the Fender bass for years. You probably remember growing up with people, they just called the electric bass a Fender bass. That might have been his greatest contribution, just in terms of how much it changed the soundscape of everything, to go from these upright basses that you could just barely hear to all of a sudden you had this full sounding electric bass. And even though Leo invented that electric bass, and I think in the first year, maybe the only two celebrities that played the Fender electric bass were Shifty Henry from the Treniers show band in Las Vegas, who were an African-American group that did a lot of, gymnastics and acrobatics and things like that. And also Joel Price, who played electric bass with Little Jimmy Dickens and the Country Boys. That was it for 1951. But, when we go into the future, it's hard to even imagine a world without the electric bass. But Leo Fender was really the guy that got those out there everywhere. Okay, so we're here in Texas, so of course we cannot avoid talking about Stevie Ray Vaughan. And Jimmy and Stevie Ray, they both came up in the 1960s playing in garage bands, and then sort of adapted into playing the blues and blues rock that they became famous for. But sort of the long point that I'm trying to make with this whole presentation is that this arc that Leo Fender had of inventing this guitar for country musicians, then figuring out that he needed to have salesmen and distributors and get them into the music stores and advertising and all that kind of stuff. It kept going from Bob Wills through Buddy Holly into these 60s garage bands. And all these same distributors were still in place, all these same guys that were selling guitars. And so, you know, when guys like Stevie Ray came along, they played Stratocasters. They bought them from the same music stores that had sold instruments to these Western swing guys 25, 30 years earlier. So to me, that's really interesting. It's kind of like, yeah, Leo established this pipeline and the oil was still running through that pipeline all these years later when Stevie Ray Vaughan became famous. And another guy that I hear used to play here in Lubbock all the time, Jimmy Vaughn, and the next slide, Eric Johnson, I believe. And these are all Texas guys that that played Fenders for those reasons that I'm just talking about. So that's basically my presentation, but I do have a little, just a coda here. Just getting back to the 1948 Bigsby electric guitar made from Earl Travis, it was such an innovation at the time that it's difficult to state now how important that single guitar was. In fact, if you go to Guitar Center or look online at the tens of thousands of solid body electric guitars available today, every single one of those instruments can be directly traced back to the Merle Travis guitar made in 1948, which sprung from the simple idea that he had: if a lap steel guitar can be made of solid wood and sustain so well, why can't we build a solid guitar that's held up the regular way? And it's incredible to me to just go from that garage in Downey, California, to Leo Fender borrowing the guitar for a week and coming out with the Telecaster, Les Paul having a Bigsby pickup on his guitar, and then eventually coming out, you know, with the Gibson Les Paul, to just this incredible world that we have now, where there's, as I mentioned, tens of thousands of solid body electric guitars out there. And I dare to say, if you were to go to every single club in the great state of Texas here tonight, that you would see a vast majority of them playing Fender guitars for this exact reason that I've been talking about. That's basically my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Everybody in the Zoom room, everybody in the room, please thank Deke Dickerson for a wonderful keynote.
I wasn't watching the clock. Did I go over?
No, it is exactly 30 minutes.
Oh man, I practiced that.
Of course you did. Are there comments or questions from folks in the room or folks in the Zoom chat? We have time for a couple of comments or questions for Deke. Yeah, please.
So it strikes me as and I don't play like this at all, so it might be tough for everybody.
That's okay.
It strikes me that from 48 to into 50, that study is short. And so I wonder, talk about this decision, especially how it got from, how quickly it got from LA to Texas. Can you speak a little bit, or do you know what the distribution timeline was worldwide in terms of going to like Australia or to the UK? Like,
That's a very good question. Well, one thing to consider is just, it wasn't just guitars or musical instrument manufacturer. Man, so much changed between 1945, when World War II ended, and 1970. I mean, like every 2 years, they completely redesigned every single car. You know, nowadays, cars kind of all look the same over a period of 20 years. But man, back then, it was just a time of extreme innovation and manufacturing explosion. And actually, you know, one thing that I should have mentioned is that Leo really figured out ways to mass market things, like by stamping them out, you know, out of metal rather than carving them out of wood. He was the guy that figured out, oh, we need to make 10,000 of these things instead of 12. But getting back to your bigger point of international distribution, that took a while. There were electric guitars that were being made in Europe, and there were electric guitars that were being made in Australia and places like that. But there were a lot stricter laws about importing stuff back then. And I know that the first Stratocaster that got to England was played by Hank Marvin in Cliff Richard's band, The Shadows. And it was like this incredible thing that nobody had seen, like, oh, Hank Marvin actually has a Fender Stratocaster from America. And it was at a time where nobody else could get one. And there's a similar story in Australia. It's in one of these books that I wrote, the Strat in the Attic. I can't remember if it's in the first one or the second one, about the first Fender Stratocaster that got to Australia. And basically, it took a while to figure out how to distribute these things over there. And interestingly enough, John Lennon had this Rickenbacker guitar that he bought used in Germany, and he put a Bigsby vibrato on it. And then all of a sudden, Bigsby had this problem of all these Beatles people wanting a Bigsby vibrato. So he actually licensed the design to a company over there, and they made British versions of Bigsby vibratos. They didn't really do that with Gibson or Fender instruments. It was more just a importing problem, and eventually there was enough demand and whatever that now you can find them all over the place there. But it took quite a while. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
Well, hit me up. Don't leave me hanging.
Okay, other questions or comments? I'm watching the Zoom chat as well. Anybody on Zoom want to weigh in? Yes, question, go ahead.
Yep. For sure, definitely. Definitely. It's more of a trebly tone closer to the bridge, and then it's more of a mellow tone closer to the neck. I guess my point that I was trying to make with the Stratocaster is that nowadays, if you offered a 3-pickup guitar, there would be all these different switch combinations where you could have all the different pickups in any variety. But, in 1954, Leo just thought, well, we'll just have a 3-position switch. You can just have one pickup at a time. Sure. Yeah. Well, it's funny, Mosrite, which was another company here in America, he made guitars with these slanted pickups by the neck, and he claimed it was to give, more bass frequencies on the bass strings and more treble frequencies on the treble strings. But I think it was really just because it looked cool.
Good. We're just about out of time, so last questions or comments? Yes, please. Go ahead.
So this is a post-war story, right?
The whole thing sort of begins in the 20s and the 30s, but it really takes off after World War II.
So to what extent do you think the post-war environment really fueled this? Why didn't it happen in the 30s?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, it's kind of like when radios came out in the 20s, they cost $800 and only the richest people in the world could afford to buy them, but then by the mid 1930s, they were selling these cheap battery powered radios that anybody could afford. It's like any kind of technology. I think it takes a certain amount of time to get the price to a point where people can buy it, combined with the fact that after World War II, you had this boom happening and people had money in their pockets for the first time. And, especially in California and Los Angeles, everybody was working, everybody was making money. I know when I moved from Missouri to California, and I started just going to antique places and garage sales and things like that, I realized for the first time, wow, these people out here had a lot of disposable income back in the day, because where I grew up in Missouri, people didn't. I know you're from the Kansas City area. You were a little higher up the ladder than we were. Yeah, there you go. Oh, absolutely. I would completely say he's the Henry Ford of the electric guitar. Yeah, and Leo Fender's an interesting guy because he didn't play guitar. He was, just a guy that had good ideas about design and knew what things work. And probably his most significant contribution was just going to musicians and saying, what do you want? Like, what is it that you want? I think that was probably his most significant thing, was just listening to make improvements based on what players wanted.
And it would seem to me also that, kind of like Bigsby, but especially Leo Fender, he was in the right city to where there was a huge, during the war, swing shift and post-war boom in nightclub gigs. We were talking about that in the panel earlier about Lubbock and what is it with Lubbock, and the fact that in Lubbock, it's still the case that the real estate cost per square foot is low enough that you can actually have a music nightclub and
Right.
break even. And in LA in 1948, you could have a music club and break even because there was still a ton of people, even as they were pivoting from wartime manufacture to making refrigerators and ranges and cars with big fins and guitars with 2 pickups instead of 1.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting when the whole boom happened on the West Coast because they couldn't keep up with housing. So a lot of people were living in trailers and even tents. And a lot of these country music shows that were going on were just going on wherever they could stuff people in. If it was an existing building, great. If it was a tent in the middle of a parking lot, great. I mean, it was just kind of an explosion.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time. That was absolutely fascinating, Deke. And,
Well, thank you very much.
Amazing tour through 70 years of culture and commerce. So please join me one more time in thanking Deke Dickerson.
Thank you very much. And thanks to you, Dr. Chris Smith and Roger Landis, for bringing me out here to Lubbock. I really appreciate it.
Everybody on Zoom, this concludes our final conference session of the day. I do want to encourage you to come out to the Lubbock Guitar Slingers concert at 7:30 p.m. in the Crickets Theater at the Buddy Holly Hall. And do look for us on the web. We're the Electric Guitar in American Culture, and you can search that and find our website. We'd love to hear from you, and we will let you know about events coming in the future. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you.